This is Big Tasty Sports.
Welcome to the first episode of the Turnover Effect. This is something I'm going to be doing at least a few episodes of. Turnovers are something that became a large interest for me with the NFL last year, and they're difficult because certainly turnovers are difficult to predict, but they have a huge influence on games, which is something I'm going to hit on really quick before we get into the main topic today, which is going to be quarterbacks. And so I think that it is at least worth, especially ahead of the season here, diving into at least some analytics around turnovers in different aspects. And when you're capping NFL, whether it's for futures or in season or just thinking about how you feel like the season will go, I think the more angles you can get on something, the better. And I will say up front, you don't want to take any of those angles and make them the thing. So even as I talk through this and talk through today is going to be focused on quarterback performance in relation to turnovers. Going to go through 12 of the ones that I thought were most interesting for this season in terms of likely starters and how they've fared in relation to interceptions. It's one thing. You could have a great quarterback who turns the ball over a little bit too much. You could have a crappy quarterback who takes care of the ball. So I'm not saying that interceptions are everything, the turnovers are everything, but they do have a big enough impact on the game that I think it's worth looking at. So that's what we're going to do. Before we jump in, we'll do the commercial stuff real quick here. Go check out bigtastysports.com for everything I'm doing. You can get there. You can sign up for the newsletter. You can check out NFL futures packages, all that kind of stuff. bigtastysports.com. Also, would really appreciate if you could drop a like on the video. We've had a lot of views here recently and a few more likes, but hey, if you're watching, doesn't take long. Would really appreciate it if you could just drop that like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done that already. If you are on the podcast, this is available on podcast as well, wherever you get your podcasts, hopefully. Please do leave a 5-star review, rate and review. That would be greatly appreciated as well. All right, commercial over. Let's dive into some things here. So like I said, for this first episode of the Turnover Effect, we're going to focus on interceptions for likely starters this year. Here's why I'm interested in turnovers. For teams that win the turnover battle by 1, their winning percentage is 69.6%. This is from an article by Covers, but there was a Harvard study done about this. You can go find lots of sources for this online, so you don't need to take my word for it. But you can if you want. Try to be trustworthy. Here's the amazing thing. Win the turnover battle by 1 and your winning percentage is almost 70%, but you win that turnover battle by 2, goes up to almost 84%, 83.9. That's pretty massive. If you win that turnover battle by 3, that goes up over 90% to 90.7%. And so this is the case I'm making, that looking at turnovers is worth it because of the massive impact it has on who wins a game. Now, quarterback interceptions are not the only turnovers that happen in a game. That's why I do want to look at some skill position stuff, historical trends, defenses, pressure rates, all that kind of stuff. And I'll do some of that in future videos. But quarterbacks have a huge impact on who wins the turnover battle because they have the ball in their hands so much. And we'll look at fumbles as well at some point, but today we're just going to focus on interceptions. Here's what I built out that I'm using to look at these. And again, I'm not saying this is the most robust thing ever, but I think it gets at some useful metrics when we look at interceptions. And this is something that once I get this whole thing built out, I'll make this available on bigtastysports.com as well. But this is going to include interceptions, fumbles, defensive pressure rates, all that kind of stuff all on one sheet. So what you can see here, if you're watching the video, if you're on the podcast, I'll just explain it, but is the likely starting quarterbacks, if their name is in gold, it means that most of their data comes from college. And I included it on here because I think it's still useful to be able to look at on a dashboard like this, but I'm not really looking heavily at that data. I am going to talk about one quarterback from college, but you really have to look into what their situation was and understand the difference in the levels between college and the pros. The ones that are colored blue there, the names, means that I have less than 5 seasons of information for them. So I went back 5 years. I wanted to focus more on recent performance. As people get older, as they develop, I wanted to focus on that more than if they have 12 years of experience or something. But I did go back 5. The ones in blue, I don't have 5 years, and I will reference that when I get to some of those quarterbacks. Then on here, I went through and looked at the number of games in each season where a quarterback had 0 interceptions, 1 interception, and then 2 or more. On this sheet, all you see is the 0 interception and 2+, because I felt like those were most influential in terms of completely taking care of the ball, or as I showed earlier, going up to that 84% plus chance of, well, and really if you're the one turning the ball over and your team loses that turnover battle by 2 or more, you're dropping your percentage of winning to like 15% or less. So that's why I included those, and I have the percentage of games where they were in each category, and then I also did whether they were over or under the average for all of these quarterbacks. And so that 0, yeah, you can see that there's a column for average right next to each of those, plus or minus. And then I have 2 columns there. These are less scientific, I guess, but there's an outlier category. What this means is, was there a season that disproportionately impacted what those numbers look like? So they might have had a season that was great in relation to turnovers, and it makes them look like they're better than they are historically, or vice versa. They could have had a really bad season, and that could have made them look worse than they actually are. And so that's on a scale of -2 to +2, based on the impact of those outliers. And then there's an improvement column, which is what it pretty much sounds like. Are they improving year over year? And that is on the same scale of -2 to +2, depending on how that looked. And then on the other side of that dark gray bar there is a metric on interceptions per pass. So I do think that the number of interceptions per game matter because of the stats that I shared at the beginning, but also very clearly some quarterbacks are passing way more than others. And so we also want to get at how many interceptions are they throwing per pass. So you can see there I have 2 things. I have the average interceptions per pass, and then standard deviations. I've run this on some of the other stuff I'm doing. I think it's really helpful because you see how far they are away from the mean. And I'll talk specifically, but you can see here, I have color coded yellow, which is, hey, they're sort of in the middle. That's from positive 0.29 to negative 0.29, and then negative 0.3 or higher is green, and positive 0.3 or higher is red. And then there is a darker green and a darker red if it's negative 0.8 or better, and then positive 0.8 or worse. So that's a whole bunch of stuff. You don't need to understand all of that. I'm not going to sit on this sheet the whole time. I'm going to actually go through some slides and hit the high points, but I wanted you to understand where this data is coming from and what I'm primarily looking at. That's enough of the deep dive stuff. Let's get into these quarterbacks. First up, we're going to talk about 12. First up is Anthony Richardson, Indianapolis Colts. Now, will Gardner Minshew start, or will Anthony Richardson? I don't know, but my guess is that at some point in the season, Anthony Richardson's going to be taken over. I highlight him here because he really sucked in his last 2 years in college here. Well, the 2 years that he really played. I mean, it's pretty atrocious. 22.62% of his games were 2 or more interceptions. That's 7.24% worse than the average. And this was in college. 3.498 standard deviations over the mean for interceptions per pass. That, if you don't understand standard deviations, once you get over 1, it's a lot. So 3.498 is terrible. In fact, that was the worst of any of the quarterbacks that I looked at. And again, this was in college. How's that going to translate to the pros? Who knows? But the reason that I wanted to highlight Richardson is he does have some athletic upside. He has a big arm, all that kind of stuff. And there's some talent there, I think. But on the turnovers, I think it's likely that he'll be very volatile at best. Maybe just bad at the beginning here, but volatile at best. And so that is not a positive to me when it comes to the Colts. I mean, is it likely that he's going to lose more games by turning the ball over a bunch or win more games by making some big plays? Could be a little bit of both, but I would put my money on it being more to the negative than the positive in year one, even if he has upside in the long run. Quarterback number 2, this is one that you would probably expect if you pay any attention to turnovers in the NFL, and that's Dak Prescott. Woof, last season was really bad. 16.67% of his games did he have 0 interceptions. The average among these quarterbacks was 52.66. It's hard for me to even say how incredibly horrible that is. 41.67% of his games, he had 2 or more interceptions. The average was 14.84, just massively worse in these categories than any of the other quarterbacks. Now, this is one of those where I talked about the outliers, and 2022 was definitely an outlier. And so we have to take that into consideration. And Dak's not probably as bad with turnovers as that season looked, or interceptions specifically. If you remove 2022, he's basically right about average, slightly below average on all of these interception metrics that I was using. And you think about last year, I mean, the Cowboys still had a good season, even with him doing that. So if he can just bring it back to what his average levels have been, which is around league average, I think that bodes well for the Cowboys. Now, whether he can do it or not, we'll see. I mean, it's hard to know what to do with a season that's such an outlier, but because it's so far out there, I would have to expect some positive regression back toward the mean and back toward his mean. So I look for Dak to be better this year than he was in an absolutely atrocious year last year. Next up is another one you would expect if you pay attention to interceptions in the NFL, and that's Justin Fields. He is 3.022 standard deviations over the mean. Like I said in the last one, for interceptions per pass attempt over the last 2 seasons. We only have the 2 seasons for him in terms of pro numbers, which is what I want to focus on. Like I said before, once you get over 1 standard deviation from the mean, it's not good. 3.022 is just pretty horrific. Obviously, he has done a ton with his legs, and he makes the Bears offense dangerous because of what he can do with his legs. But if he can't rein in these problems with his turnovers and help them to have a little bit better offense overall, where it doesn't just rely on his legs, I think that's problematic for the Bears, and it's probably difficult for his health as well in the long run. He only had 38.18% of games with 0 interceptions. That's 14.5% under the average for these quarterbacks. So really bad. In other words, this man knows how to throw the ball to the other team. And it's going to be interesting to see if he can improve in this area, improve on his accuracy, improve in his passing overall to help this Bears team have a better offense, which they're going to need. Given the defense, quick plug, watch for the NFC North Divisional preview coming out where we'll talk more about the Bears as a whole team. But Justin Fields, when it's this bad, this is where I think that the turnovers actually can matter some. And while Justin Fields did win some games for the Bears, or keep them in games at least with his heroics, he also really hurt them with the turnovers. And I think that has to be better for the Bears to take a step forward. Next up, we've got Trevor Lawrence. I am very high on Lawrence, very high on the Jags, if you've been paying attention to any of my future stuff. So I admit a little bit of bias coming into this, though I certainly do try to stick to the numbers. And if I'm wrong on stuff, I would like to know, because I would like to get out of bets or make different bets. So while I want to admit my biases, I also really do fight to pay attention to numbers and not be beholden to those biases. Trevor Lawrence, I think there's positive stuff to take away here. He went from 29.41% of his games having 2 or more interceptions to 11.76 from 2021 to 2022. He has an average of 58.82% of his professional games with 0 interceptions, which is 7.76% above the mean. I want to talk about why I think this is. So that year with Urban Meyer, with old Herb, was rough. And one of the things that happens when it's bad, and they're playing from behind or the offense isn't clicking, is then you feel like you have to force things. And I think Trevor Lawrence probably felt like he really had to force things. And that, I think, came through in the turnover numbers then, because when you try to force things that you shouldn't, you're going to throw more balls that can get picked off. Last year, those interception numbers got a lot better and reflected more of what he did in college. I don't want to rely on college too heavily because it's a different game, but it's not like he's had a turnover problem his whole career going back to college. This year, he gets more weapons. The Jags should be a better team overall. They play in a fairly bad division. And so I don't think that he should be in situations where he has to force the ball a lot. Whether he does or not is another question. But I think if he can play within the offense, do more of what he did last year, I think these interception numbers could get even better. And that only is another element to me that makes the Jaguars even more difficult to deal with. I think this offense is going to be good. And if you don't give the ball away, man, it's going to be something tough to deal with. So I'm bullish on Trevor Lawrence, especially in this area of turnover. Well, I am overall. I've shared before that I have a bet on him for MVP even. And I think that this is an area that can help with that if he can avoid turning the ball over again and improve year over year from last season. Next up, we have Jordan Love. And man, if we're going to talk about bias, I always own it here as a Vikings fan. I cannot possibly like the Packers, but let's look at the numbers. All we have on Jordan Love is college seasons from over 3 years ago. Why would we even talk about it? Because certainly he's got to be a different quarterback now than he was then. Well, the reason we're going to talk about it is because it's all we have to go off of and because it's significant. Now, these numbers might end up meaning nothing because he could be totally different, but I think it's at least just worth throwing out there. In those 2 college seasons we have to look at, 23.08% of games with 2 or more interceptions. It's 8 or 9% over the average for this group of quarterbacks, and that's in college. It's not good. 1.528 standard deviations over the mean for interceptions per pass attempt in those seasons. We're going to get to Aaron Rodgers later, but I'm just going to give you a little preview that Aaron Rodgers is very good when it comes to not turning the ball over. And Jordan Love, in all we have to go off of, was pretty bad with turning the ball over. Now, the Packers might be better than I've thought they will be this year. They certainly have a chance to be a good defense again. They have a young skill position core. But Jordan Love can't be turning the ball over all the time. And I think that is one of the places where he could falter here in his first full season as a starter. I have at the bottom here, we can all not worry about this because the hometown reporters say he looks better than expected. So, he should be good because hometown reporters are never biased. But watch Jordan Love as we get into the season and see how he does in this area. Maybe he'll prove that he's figured this out. But if not, I think this could be part of the storyline for the Packers this year. Next up, we have Jimmy Garoppolo. I just have a picture of his face because it's actually really hard to find pictures of him throwing a football. It's not something that he does very much. So who knows how many games he'll even get in for the Raiders this year. He's not even working out. Not working out fully right now because of, I think it was a toe surgery or something. But in terms of turnovers, interceptions, 24.42% of games with 2 or more interceptions. That's almost 10% below average, and 0.84 standard deviations above the mean for interceptions per pass. It's not quite to 1, but it's still not good. That still would be in the dark red category for me. So Jimmy Garoppolo has not been good historically when it comes to interceptions. And without the 2022 season, it would be even worse. He had 75% of his games with 0 interceptions in 2022. So that makes all his stats look better than they would be historically. And that would tell me that it's more likely that he regresses a little bit back toward his actual mean than that he's made these huge improvements and is actually better when he's not even playing much. So basically on interceptions, Derek Carr is better. We'll see who's better overall as a quarterback this year, if Jimmy even sees the field. We move on to Jared Goff. We are hitting on almost all of the NFC North quarterbacks. We will not be hitting on Kirk Cousins, who, like in everything else, is just pretty meh on everything. including in interceptions. So we won't touch on him, but we are going to touch on Jared Goff. The most interesting thing to me is the incredible improvement from his years with the Rams to his years with the Lions. I'm not going to, but if I did flip over to that turnover sheet that I showed you, I mean, it is just pretty astounding growth. If you just look at his 2 years with the Lions, only 6.51% of games with 2 or more interceptions. That would be third best in the league out of all of these quarterbacks if you went with that number. Which again, we have to look at the whole history, but it's really good. And if you just took those 2 seasons, 0.0135 interceptions per pass, that would be second best of all these QBs. So when it comes to turnovers, Jared Goff has been incredible since coming to the Lions. And I think this is a really balanced Lions team. Again, not going to go into a whole team breakdown, but it's going to be hugely helpful for them, well, as it would be for any team. But I don't think Jared Goff has to make too much happen. And it feels like that's where he's been with the Lions. He hasn't been trying to make too much happen. And that showed up in his interception numbers. So the question is, can he keep that rolling, or is there some regression in store where he moves back towards some of those numbers with the Rams? Even the numbers with the Rams were fairly close to average across this group of quarterbacks. So they weren't bad. It just wasn't as good as what these numbers have looked like with the Lions. But he's been damn good for 2 years straight with the Lions here when it comes to turnovers. Daniel Jones, slayer of the mighty Minnesota Vikings defense from 2022 in the playoffs. And by mighty, I mean exactly the opposite. But Daniel Jones, a quarterback who I don't think, even for me, is not generally looked on incredibly positively. I'm kind of wondering if Daniel Jones, though, is one of those guys that, I mean, he's better than what you're going to get for most teams. Not great, but better. And the fumbles have been an issue for Daniel Jones in the past, which, again, we'll look at in a different video, and I don't have numbers in front of me. So maybe I'm even wrong on that. We'll check it. But when it comes to interceptions, this guy's been improving year over year for the last 5 years. You look at his percentage of games with no interceptions, 36.36, 46.15, 42.86, 63.64, and then 75% last year. So he's improved in those 5 years from 36% to 75. That's such a massive improvement. I mean, that is absolutely huge. It's been true for his interception per pass rate as well, from 0.026, and I won't read them all off, but all the way to 0.010. So more than 100% improvement. That's not what I think of when I think of Daniel Jones, a guy who has significantly improved when it comes to his passing, at least in relationship to the interceptions. This year, they do have some more weapons in the passing game. That could be positive because he gets more open receivers. The way it could be negative is if they lean on him to throw the ball even more, and then maybe he starts to force stuff. But I think this is another one that I'm highlighting because I think Daniel Jones is a positive, at least when it comes to the interceptions. And that's something to kind of throw into your thought process when you think about the NFC East and you think about the New York Giants this year. So I'm impressed by Daniel Jones more than I thought I would be when it comes to interceptions. All right, we got a few quarterbacks left. We are moving right through these. Some interesting ones, some big names here at the end. Josh Allen, I guess they're all kind of big names. They're NFL starters, but you know what I'm saying. Some more than others. Buffalo Bills. Obviously, one of the great quarterbacks in the league. Part of that has to do with his ability to escape the pocket, his size, his ability to run. All those things are in play when it comes to Josh Allen, and he does have a big arm. I think there is a bit of cause for concern when it comes to his interceptions, though. 25.05% of his games with 2 or more interceptions, 10% below average. And remember what I said at the beginning about how drastically it affects your ability to win when you lose that turnover battle by 2 or more. It affects it even for 1, but 2 or more, it's a really big deal. And when you're turning the ball over, throwing that many interceptions, you're putting your team in a bad spot. He actually had a good year with turnovers or interceptions in 2019, which makes these interception stats look even better than they would otherwise. When you look at that average interceptions per pass, he is slightly above the average for these quarterbacks in that statistical category. He'd be right around average, like right on the average if you took out 2019. So it's not like it's anything horrible here. I'm just saying when you look at some of these teams that will be competing to win their divisions, will be competing to make it to the Super Bowl and even win the Super Bowl, we need to look at where potential downfalls come in. And I think it's worth continuing to watch, especially the frequency with which Josh Allen throws multiple interceptions. This is a good team, and against a lot of them, especially the middling teams in the NFL, they turn the ball over once he throws a pick. It's probably not going to be a huge deal, and they'll be fine. But when he starts to throw 2 or 3 in a game, and again here historically, it's a quarter of his games where he does that, he puts his team in a bad situation. And so I think that's something worth monitoring and worth keeping in mind as you think overall about the Buffalo Bills. We're going to get to another AFC East team here in a minute where the turnover story is very different. And I think it's just one of those things that is worth keeping in mind when you think about these teams and divisions. Next up is Jalen Hurts. We only have 3 years of data here for the pros, but he's improved year over year. He's already 12.16% above average in terms of 0 interception games, so really good. If you take out his rookie year, he'd be second for 0 interception games and fourth for 2 or more interception games. So that rookie season was, a little bit of a struggle. But since then, man, he's been phenomenal. And he plays behind a great offensive line. He can use his feet to get out of trouble. He has good receiving weapons. I mean, he's in a great situation. So if you threw Jalen Hurts in a bad situation, if he was on the Houston Texans, how would he be? Yeah, I don't know. Certainly not as good as he is, but that's not the situation he's in. And in this one, he's performed really well in a variety of aspects, but it includes the turnovers. He's borderline green in my metrics for interception per pass. So even there, it hasn't been phenomenal, but same thing. If you take out that rookie season, he would be in the green for me. And with the situation he's in, I don't see any reason for him to go the other way. I think the only thing here would be that their schedule's a little bit tougher, but I would expect Jalen Hurts to continue to be very solid when it comes to turnovers, not put his team in a bad situation. And with that defense and the way this offense is overall, I think it is another thing that bodes well for the Philadelphia Eagles this year. We got 2 quarterbacks left, 2 who are among the most interesting to me in terms of what the impact could be with turnovers this year. The first one up is Russell Wilson. Boy, rough season last year in every single way. But I was a little bit shocked, and maybe I should have known this would be the case, but I didn't. That when I ran all these metrics, he is one of only 2 quarterbacks. The other one, which you have not seen yet, you could probably guess who it is coming up next. But he's one of 2 quarterbacks who are green across the board on these metrics that I looked at. One of only 2. It's pretty solid. 57.19% of his games are 0 interceptions. That's 10% above average. 9.1% of his games are 2 or more interceptions. That's 5.75% below average. I mean, in a good way, but you want to be below average in 2 or more interception games. And he's minus 0.601 standard deviations below the mean in interceptions per pass, which again is not in the dark green for me, but that's like a light green metric. It's good to be below, negative in standard deviations on that measure. So last year was not as good. I'm actually going to glance over here real quick at Russell Wilson on my overall sheet here where it's year by year. Too much scrolling. All right. Yeah, last year, so he's mostly been above 60% for zero interception games. He was at 46% last year. He's mostly been below 10% for 2 or more interception games. He was at 13% last year. So it wasn't atrocious. I don't want to say that it wasn't this massive outlier, but it was an outlier. I'm really interested to see what Sean Payton can do here. If you can get Russell Wilson back to something like the Russell Wilson he was in Seattle, maybe not quite as dynamic, but if he doesn't turn the ball over, they can run the ball. He's got good weapons in the passing game, and they have a solid defense. This could bode well for the Broncos, and I think it's one of those. I don't want to overreact, and I was really high on the Broncos last year, and that did not turn out well. But man, if Russell Wilson can perform better again, not like the kind of one bad outlier season, I think the Broncos could be more dangerous than we think. I'll leave it there for now. And then the last one up, which is very interesting to me, is Aaron Rodgers. He has moved on from the Green Bay Packers to the New York Jets. And all I can say for this guy's interception metrics is damn. He's number one in every category, and it's really not close. 73% of his games, no interceptions. That's 20% above the average. Below 5%, 4.85% of his games are 2 or more interceptions. That's 10% below the average for that. He's 1.318 standard deviations below the mean in interceptions per pass. One of 2 people who are at least 1 standard deviation below the mean. I mean, he's not only is he green across the board, which Russell Wilson is, he's dark green across the board, and he's the only one who's dark green across the board. And here's the crazy thing. All of this would be significantly better if you took out last year, which was a negative outlier for him and significant one. Just listen to some of these stats. 0% percentage of games with 0 interceptions in the last 5 seasons, starting in 2018. 87%, 75, 75, 81. Last year, 47%, way lower. 2 interception games, starting in 2018. 0. 6.25, 6.25. That's 1 game each of those seasons. And then last year is still only 2 games, but 11.76. I mean, even his bad season last year was a little worse than average in a couple categories, but better than average in the 2 or more turnovers. So he has a bad season, and he's still around league average or a little better. So the question here is a significant one, because the Jets defense is good. We know that. And last year, they just were totally hosed by Zach Wilson and the offense. So the question is Aaron Rodgers slipping? Do these numbers get worse? His passing numbers overall weren't as good last year. Do they all continue to get worse, including his turnover metrics? Or was last year actually an outlier? And now he returns to something like being best in the league when it comes to turnovers, paired with a defense who is going to get a lot of stops for him and for that offense. If he's able to do that, I think it bodes really well for the Jets. And that's why when it comes specifically to interceptions with these quarterbacks, this is the most important one in terms of how I see it and the effect that it'll actually have on the season. So very interested to watch the move from a bad Zach Wilson and a bad Joe Flacco to best in the league when it comes to turnovers to interceptions, Aaron Rodgers, and what that means for the Jets this year. All right, that is it for this episode of The Turnover Effect. Would love to hear any thoughts you have on these quarterbacks specifically. Again, appreciate you watching, dropping a like, check out BigTastySports.com, and I will talk to you soon.